All right. Welcome to the Human Development Lecture. Moving on. So, when developmental psychologists talk about the lifespan, they talk about the entire lifespan, literally, from conception, the moment of conception, all the way to the moment of death. This is not meant to start any sort of debate on when life begins, but from a developmental psychologist point of view, the uteral environment is an environment that impacts later life, impacts personality and behavior later in life. So it is something that developmental psychologists will study. So from conception to death, that is the lifespan that we are interested in. And since this is a field, a subfield in psychology, we are interested in human behavior. And specifically, we're interested in how human behavior changes across that lifespan. So, looking specifically at some possible questions asked in the developmental psychology realm. Those questions are listed on the bottom of the slide. How are babies impacted by drug use in utero? How do children learn to speak? What factors influence excuse me, what factors influence sexual maturation at adolescence? Does personality stay the same as we age? How do we make friends in nursing homes? So these questions cover that whole lifespan from conception to death, from in utero all the way down to the end of life when we are in some sort of nursing home. These are important questions to ask because they can have very important social policy implications. Things like the Head Start program. This is a program for very young children, earlier than kindergarten age. Kindergarten starts at 6 years of age. So this would be for children younger than 6. This is an educational environment for some of these young children to go to. And the research has shown that these are actually very beneficial for later success in life for these children who attend these programs. So, this is again one of those very good investments that public monies might be made in public future. The HPV vaccine, a great case study of this would be the state of Colorado. The state of Colorado started offering the HPV vaccine free to any children in the state of Colorado. And lo and behold, STD rates and cervical cancer rates just plummeted a few years after these vaccines were freely distributed, which saved the state millions and millions and millions of dollars in healthcare costs. Subsidized birth control, another great example. This is also something that the state of Colorado is doing. I believe it's fully subsidized for most people. It's completely free. And once again, this has saved the state of Colorado millions and millions of dollars in the costs associated with things like teen pregnancy, things of that nature. And we also have social policy implications for older adult health, specifically mental health, physical health. We're all going to be old someday. There's really nothing separating you and me from a 90-year-old person except for time. We will be in that situation at some point. So it's important that um, there are policies in place that will help us live a happy and healthy life later on in adulthood. This might not be something you care about at the moment, but it will be something you start to care more and more about as you get older. So let's talk about that whole lifespan. We're going to kind of just briefly touch on some of the bigger topics, some of the bigger pieces of research, and the bigger researcher names in each stage of that lifespan. So we're going to start out in utero, from the moment of conception. Some of the big things that have been studied in utero are basically the dangers that exist in that environment. And we call these teratogens. These are foreign substances that can damage the fetal development inside the womb. teratogens. It's kind of a fun word to say. And these teratogens can fall into a couple different categories. Drugs would be one. FAS there stands for fetal alcohol syndrome. On the right hand side of the slide, you can see an image of a young girl who happens to have fetal alcohol syndrome. She was exposed to alcohol, large quantities of alcohol in the womb. And there are some physical characteristics listed in that image that typically are associated with fetal alcohol syndrome. So that's sort of the physical appearance side of things. But on the behavioral side of things, children who suffer from fetal alcohol syndrome also tend to have very quick tempers. They tend to be prone to violence as well. So obviously, for some pretty obvious reasons, you want to avoid introducing large amounts of alcohol into any developing fetus in the womb. Another category of teratogens is environmental. A good recent example of this would be BPA. If you've ever looked at a water bottle recently, like a Nalgene or something like that, it might proudly say BPA free. BPA was a chemical included in a lot of plastics up until recently, and it's been shown that this chemical can actually disrupt the sexual development. We're talking primary characteristics, primary sexual characteristics. The initial study was done on frogs, I believe. It showed that large amounts of BPA in their water supply would disrupt the normal development of sexual characteristics of frogs. So they'd be born with equipment that wasn't quite working. So I'm not totally sure if there was ever any conclusive evidence that it had a major impact on human sexual development, but just to be safe, it's been taken out of a lot of plastics that hold food or water. And the last category listed for teratogens there is infections. So toxoplasmosis is a term you may have heard. You may have heard the idea that pregnant women should not change cat litter. That is because cat feces tends to contain a specific virus that can lead to toxoplasmosis. And unfortunately, one of the really nasty side effects of this virus is that it attacks any developing fetus in the woman's body. And unfortunately, in some really bad cases of toxoplasmosis, the fetus or the child can be born with missing limbs. So this is definitely something to take very seriously. Um, Very dangerous teratogen there. So once the child is born, they're outside of the womb, and then we can start talking about some behaviors that are there from the very instant of birth. We're going to call these reflexes, newborn reflexes. And just two examples here. One would be the suckling reflex, and another would be the grasping reflex. So the suckling reflex is just like it sounds. It's when a newborn's cheek is stimulated. You can actually do this if you have a newborn handy. You can rub their cheek, and typically they will, in a reflexive way, turn towards that stimulation on their cheek and try to suck on it. The idea here is that they are probably reaching for a nipple, which will provide them some sustenance. The grasping reflex, you can also do this if you have a newborn handy. You can stimulate the palm of the newborn's hand, and they will grasp onto whatever it is that's stimulating the palm of their hand. Excuse me. This reflex is thought to be sort of a built-in safety feature, or possibly a leftover reflex from our evolutionary past. You can imagine if a newborn had something drag or brush across their palm, it might be beneficial to grab onto whatever that is. It could save them from a nasty fall or something like that. So again, these reflexes are present from the moment of birth. We also have some preferences in newborns that are in existence from the moment of birth. We have voice preferences, language preferences, and facial preferences. So newborns will prefer to hear their mother's voice. And when I say prefer, I mean that they will attend to, they will focus on their mother's voice more than a stranger's voice or another relative's voice, or in some cases, even the father's voice. Newborns prefer their mother's voice. And the thinking here is that they have actually heard their mother's voice in the womb. They hear it literally every time the mother speaks. So in utero, in the womb, these fetuses, these little children, get used to that voice, and they actually prefer it over all others. It's literally the only voice they know. They also have a preference for their mother's native language. And again, when I mean preference, they will attend to uh, at the expense of other languages. So if you play them a short snippet of the mother's native language, let's say it's English, they will pay attention to those English words more than if you played them a short snippet of, let's say, Spanish or French or German. They won't attend to those languages as much. We also have some facial preferences for faces. Yes, they do prefer their mother's face, even though it's, the first time they've seen it. But we also have a newborn preference for attractive faces. So researchers have compiled these huge databases of different faces, and they've been ranked on attractiveness. And you can show a newborn an attractive face, and they will stare at it longer than if you show them a less attractive face. I won't say ugly face, but a less attractive face. I think that's very interesting that these newborns, having no experience in the world whatsoever, still have attractiveness preferences. There seems to be something universal about an attractive face. All right, so moving on from being, excuse me, being newborn, we're going to talk about early childhood. And I want to start by touching on the topic of infantile amnesia. This is the idea that we do not have reliable memories before the age of 4. And this is because around the age of 4, the hippocampus is fully developed. Now, I will say we're going to talk quite a bit about the hippocampus later on in the memory chapter. But right now, I just want to briefly say that it is responsible for short term memory. It allows short term memories to become long term memories. And I think that's all I'm going to say for now. So it's safe to say if your hippocampus isn't fully developed, it's not really working quite yet, then you're not going to have short term memory. If you're not going to have short term memory, you're not going to have long term memory. And I'm saying this specifically about explicit memories, which again, we'll talk more about explicit and implicit memories later on. The summary statement here is that a hippocampus is necessary for memory. Without one, which we don't really have one before the age of 4, we can't really have memories. There have been numerous studies done on this, and all these studies show that all the memories that people have before the age of 4 are unreliable. They're not necessarily real, they didn't really happen. They're highly susceptible to suggestion. So there are people out there, and there might even be some people in this class who have some memories from very, very, very early in their lives. I used to have a friend who constantly claimed that they remember the act of breastfeeding with their mother years and years and years ago. But I challenged them on that numerous times, and it soon became aware, at least to me, that the story just kind of changed a little bit every time they told it. So not sure if they were remembering that actual memory before they had a hippocampus, or they were just remembering the last time they remembered that story. But anyway, infantile amnesia usually occurs before the age of 4, before we have a functioning hippocampus. All right, so talked about memory. Let's talk about other cognitive abilities in early childhood. Some of the big questions here that developmental psychologists are trying to figure out in this stage of life is the nature versus nurture debate. How much of these cognitive abilities are innate? how much of them are nurture? We're born genetically pre-programmed to have these abilities. And how much of those abilities are developed through learning, through social interaction, the nurture side of the debate. And this is a debate as old as science, as old as the psychology. How much of who we are is genetically predispositioned, and how much of who we are is a result of our upbringing, our past experience. So things like counting, language, attention span, these are all at least somewhat influenced by nature, somewhat influenced by nurture. And we can actually learn a lot about these abilities by studying them through a developmental lens. We can learn a lot about we can learn a lot about what language is by studying uh, the ways that it develops. We can look at case studies, and we'll talk about this. We can look at case studies of people who have not been exposed to social interaction for their childhood. These are some extreme cases of deprivation. We will talk about these case studies later on, but we have found that language is a skill that needs nurture. We are not genetically predisposed to develop language on our own. We have sort of the building blocks of language there, but we need some sort of social input to fully develop language abilities. So language is a really good one there. So we can also learn a lot through developmental psychology by looking at the different mistakes that children make. I've got a wonderful little Calvin and Hobbes comic down there at the bottom of the slide. For those of you who are not familiar with Calvin and Hobbes, I envy you because you can experience the wonderful Calvin and Hobbes for the very first time. All right. Another wonderful mistake that children make, there's going to be quite a few videos in this lecture. And again, I can't really show them on this software right here. So I'm just going to give you the links on the Canvas page, and you can go ahead and watch them at your own leisure. Go ahead and pause this video to watch the YouTube video there. So scale error, this is it's a silly mistake that kids make. I highly encourage you watch this video. This is a child's inability to scale their own bodies with objects in their environment, which tells us that scaling is a learned cognitive process. So this is not an ability that children are born with. This is something they have to learn. So what do I mean when I say a scale error? Excuse me, I have been dealing with a really bad cough lately. So what I mean is that children will not properly think they are the size that they are. They think they'll be able to fit into things that they are too big for, or they'll think that they're the opposite. They think that they're too small for things that they're too big for. Go ahead and watch that video. There's a wonderful little child in there who seems to think that they can fit into this tiny little toy car without much success. All right, moving on to the biggest name in developmental psychology, Jean Piaget. Jean Piaget gave us many different ideas, and one of those is schemas. We're going to start with schemas. We're going to talk quite a bit about Piaget here. So schemas. Schemas are basically knowledge frameworks about the world. You can have schemas for a particular object. For example, you could have a schema for a dog. You might have a pet dog, so you're very familiar with dogs, and your particular dog, let's say, is very friendly. Maybe it's a black dog with some shaggy hair. So as a young child, that is the only dog you know. That is your schema for a dog. But as you grow through your life, you meet more dogs, you get introduced to more and more dogs. Some are friendly, some are not, some are big, some are small, some are black, some are white, some are brown, all the different kinds of colors of dogs. So as you age and get more experience with dogs, your schema for a dog kind of changes. And that fits right in with the next two words down there, assimilation and accommodation. So assimilation occurs when we fit new knowledge into a schema. So like the example I was just giving, let's say you're a young child, you've only known your one black shaggy dog your whole life, but then you meet your neighbor's dog, who happens to be a very large, brown, short-haired dog. So this would be an example of assimilation. You're told that that is also a dog, so now you have two examples of dogs, and you think to yourself, wow, dogs are not only black and shaggy, they can be short-haired and brown as well. That would be an example of assimilation. They're fitting new knowledge into an existing schema. Accommodation would occur if the schema was changed. So an example of this would be you have your one black shaggy dog that you're familiar with, and you are introduced to the neighbor's cat. Cats are similar to dogs, but they are different. They look a little different. They're smaller. They have usually a more prehensile tail. They have four very pointy claws on the ends of their feet. They behave a little differently. So you've got this new critter that's kind of similar to a dog, but you're told this is not a dog. This is a cat. So now you've changed a schema. You have created a new schema for cats. So that would be an example of accommodation. So assimilation is taking new knowledge and fitting it into an existing schema. Accommodation would be changing a schema or creating a new schema. Assimilation errors occur quite frequently in kids. This is incorrectly fitting new information into existing schemas. So that schema should be altered or a new schema should be created. An example here would be you are that same kid who owns that black shaggy dog, and you go to the zoo for the first time. And you're in the zoo and you see the monkeys. Monkeys have four legs, they've got a tail, they are fuzzy, they're mammals. They could conceivably be confused for a dog. So an example of an assimilation error would be that kid looking at the monkeys and say, look at the dog. He's seeing the monkeys and he's fitting it into his current schema for dog. This is an example of an assimilation error. He's taking new knowledge and fitting it into an existing schema, and it doesn't quite fit right. What that kid needs to do is create a new schema. He needs to engage in accommodation. He needs to be told basically that monkeys, while similar to dogs, are different animals. He needs to create a new schema for monkeys. And you see these types of errors all the time. Little kids engage in them quite frequently. Sometimes they're funny, sometimes they're just bizarre. All right, moving on to Piaget's stages. And this is what Piaget is most known for, his developmental theory, stage developmental theory. We talked a little bit about Freud being kind of the first to at least popularize stage developmental theories. Well, Piaget kind of went with that idea and ran with it. This is probably what he's most famous for. So we're going to talk about his stages now. And the very first stage in Piaget's theory is the sensory motor stage. This is from birth to age 2. So during the sensory motor stage, children are interacting with their environment physically through their physical senses. They're kind of figuring out how the world works through direct interaction of the senses. Touch, sight, hearing, smell, taste. You see little kids tasting everything. They're always putting things in their mouths. So during the sensory motor stage, we have a very heavy reliance on the senses. And that leads into the first milestone in life, according to Piaget. And this occurs in the sensory motor stage, and this is object permanence. Object permanence occurs around 8 months of age. And this is the idea that an object continues to exist even if you are not getting direct incoming sensory information from that object. So, as an example, this is why peekaboo is so fun for little children. You guys know peekaboo. You hide your face behind your hands or a blanket or something like that, and then you pull your hands away and you say peekaboo, and the little kid smiles and giggles, and literally to them, you disappeared. When you had your hands in front of your face, they were no longer getting direct sensory information from your face. They could not see you, therefore, you didn't exist. So when you take your hands away and you suddenly reappear, that's an amazing magic trick. You just reappeared out of nowhere. So around 8 months of age, young kids gain this idea of object permanence. And the idea here is that you continue to exist even though I can't directly see you. So that's about the time that peekaboo no longer becomes fun. Even though there might be some rudimentary establishment of object permanence, it's not a skill that's fully developed right away. And I've got a video linked here for an experiment that some researchers did, and they show some of the areas for improvement of these young kids who first exhibit object permanence. After the sensory motor stage, we have what Piaget calls the pre-operational stage. This is from age 2 to about 6.5. So in this stage, language is gained, but not logic. That's sort of the operational stage that Piaget is referring to. So this is the pre-operational stage, before logic. Logic is gained in the operational stage. So in the pre-operational stage, children are very egocentric. Meaning that they don't necessarily have a theory of mind. And this is sort of the main milestone of the pre-operational stage is the theory of mind. Now, the theory of mind can be summarized as the realization that others have a different perspective, that other people know different things and have different experiences than you do. This is something that all of you in this class have, but it doesn't occur until around age 4. The idea that someone else has different thoughts, different experiences than me. So we can have some really silly types of egocentric errors that little kids make. And once again, I encourage you to click that link or click on the link that's provided in the Canvas page to see a short little experiment where this little kid realizes, or does not realize rather, that he cannot see inside this little M&M's package, or he can see, but he doesn't realize that his dad can't see. So again, that's going back to that theory of mind. So the little kid can see inside the bag, but he doesn't realize that dad cannot. All right, moving on to the last two stages in Piaget's model. The concrete operational stage occurs at age 6.5 to 11. And this is when, according to Piaget, they start to have logic. They can understand concrete events. They start to gain some rudimentary mathematical abilities, logic. Conservation of matter is probably the major milestone achieved in the concrete operational stage. This typically occurs around age 7. This is a very well-known developmental milestone. This is, simply put, it's the idea that just because an object changes shape does not mean it changes volume. So over on the right-hand side of the slide, I have a short little image here of one of these many experiments that have been done on this exact issue. What you can do is you bring a child into the laboratory and you show them two containers of liquid. And first of all, you establish that they're the same amount. There's the same amount of liquid in this one and this one. And you can ask them, all right, is there the same amount of liquid here? And, they might say, oh, this one's a little higher, so you can pour a little bit of this one into that one. And, eventually they're satisfied. And yes, okay, same amount of liquid in container 1 and container 2. Then you take one of the containers and you pour it into a differently shaped container. And then you once again ask them, okay, which container has more liquid? And more often than not, they will point to the taller one. Because to them, taller means more. So obviously, they have the same amount of liquid. The child literally watched the two containers containing the same amount of liquid, just one got poured into a different container. But because it's a different shape, the child thinks it has a different amount. So this child has not gained the idea of conservation of matter. So I would probably guess that this kid is under 7 years of age. So again, after 7 years of age, conservation of matter. If you were to give this test to an 8 or 9-year-old, they would usually do pretty well. So that's conservation of matter, the major milestone in the concrete operational stage. Next up is the formal operational stage. This occurs at 11 years old and onward. This is when, according to Piaget, they have full abstract thinking. They can think about non-concrete events, non-concrete objects, ideas. In Piaget's mind, 11-year-olds have a fully developed mind. And that is one of the big criticisms of Jean Piaget is, are you really telling me that an 11-year-old has a fully developed mind? Have you ever met an 11-year-old? That is quite a stretch by any measure of the imagination. All right, so those are Piaget's stages, those 4 stages. We got the sensory motor, the major milestone there. I'm going to go back a slide. The sensory motor stage, the major milestone there would be object permanence. We've got the pre-operational stage. The major milestone here would be egocentric thinking, or rather gaining a theory of mind. We've got the concrete operational stage. The major milestone here would be conservation of matter. And then the formal operational stage, the major milestone here is abstract. All right, so there we go. There's your summary slide. Sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, formal operational. Now, I see that symbolic reasoning is added here. Don't worry about that at the moment. We'll talk about that later on. These are the main milestones, and this is a stage developmental theory. This is definitely a textbook example of one. You've got 4 stages, and in each stage, there's some major conflict that needs to be resolved or some sort of milestone that needs to be reached. And once that milestone is achieved, that is sort of the main goal of that particular stage. So that's Piaget, very, very famous name, very, very big name in developmental psychology. And here's a picture of the man himself, sort of an eccentric looking older Frenchman. And here we go, some of the main criticisms of Jean Piaget. First and foremost, the participants that he used to develop his theories were his own children. Now, there's a lot of things wrong with that. But first and foremost, and kind of glaringly, is the fact that, academics are typically higher individuals in society. They come from a higher class, typically. So the children of an academic might have quite a bit of privilege. So the children of an academic might not be great examples of humanity in general. So if you're going to draw these broad reaching theories of how humans develop, you might want to use more than just the 3 or 4 easily available children that you have at your disposal. So that's criticism number 1. Number 2, and this is not just at Piaget, this is sort of a criticism of stage theories in general, is that they're too simplistic. So let's go back. I don't know, we can stay on this slide. But the sensory motor stage, that is from the moment of birth to the first 2 years of life. The first 2 years of life, and you want to say that the only important thing that happens there is that you gain object permanence? That's a little bit crazy to my thinking. This is the first 2 years that you exist on this planet. Think of all the just immense things that you're experiencing. You're hearing for the first time. You're seeing for the first time. You're touching and tasting and smelling for the first time. And the only thing that matters is object permanence. Obviously, there's a lot more going on in the first 2 years of life. Progression through the different stages is based solely on nature. Piaget is firmly on the nature side of the nature versus nurture debate. He doesn't really give any credence to the nurture side. That's another big criticism there. And then I already mentioned this previously, but abstract reasoning at 11 years old, that's a fully developed mind. Again, maybe you should hang out with a few more 11-year-olds. You might change your mind. And, I already briefly mentioned this, no consideration for nurture. And that is a great segue into our next developmental psychologist, Lev Vygotsky. Vygotsky's theories were kind of a direct uh, response to Piaget's heavy emphasis on nature. So Vygotsky came in and said, no, 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 you need to focus on nurture a little bit more. And that's exactly what he did. Vygotsky said that Piaget is wrong. Children don't learn these new skills because of any sort of inherent genetic predisposition. They learn these new skills like object permanence, conservation of matter. They learn this through social interaction. And how do we learn best through social interaction? Vygotsky said we learn best through something called scaffolding. Scaffolding is helping a child with a challenging task the right amount. So and think about this, we've probably all had this experience trying to learn something new and someone helps us too much. Let's say we're trying to learn maybe a new language. And if someone is constantly telling us the appropriate response to a question, we are not going to be learning how to produce those responses on our own. We're simply going to be learning how to parrot whatever this person is telling us to say. So learning isn't actually occurring in that situation. So that's an example of too much help. You can also have an example of too little help. Let's say you're trying to learn a new language and someone's not helping you at all. They're asking you expert level questions, even though you are a first day beginner. Well, that's not going to be helpful either because you're not going to know what in the heck they're talking about. You're not going to know anything about the questions that they're trying to ask you. So that's scaffolding. Scaffolding provides just the right amount of help, enough help for the child or the person to build confidence because they are correctly answering the questions, but not too much help that they don't feel like they're actually learning anything themselves. And this is what Vygotsky called the proximal zone of development, the optimal amount of scaffolding, not too much, not too little, right in that sweet spot where you're still being challenged, but you're not being challenged to the point of, I'm going to give up, I don't understand this. All right, moving on past Piaget and Vygotsky, we have to talk about Harlow and Harlow. So Harlow and Harlow were a husband-wife research team, and they were interested in developmental psychology, specifically how we develop attachment, how we develop attachment styles, how important attachment is to the rest of our lives. And I highly encourage you to click on the link provided on the Canvas page to watch this short little video about the Harlow and Harlow monkey experiments. In summary, what they did is that they took these little rhesus monkeys and they put them in cages and they provided them with two different sort of artificial mothers. So one mother, let's look at the one on the right at first. This is the cloth mother. It's sort of got a monkey face on it, and it's covered in this soft blanket. So it's soft to the touch. It's kind of comforting to touch for the little rhesus monkeys there. The other mother provided is this one on the left, and it's simply a wire frame, no soft touch there, no comforting tactile sensation for these little monkeys, no monkey face for a head, but what the wire mother does is it provides nourishment. Milk was dispensed from the wire mother. Milk was not dispensed from the cloth mother. And what they found is that the monkeys, even though they were getting nourishment from the wire mothers, never spent any time with them. They would spend all their time just hanging on to the cloth mother. It looked like them, it was comforting, it was soft to touch. They would kind of rush over to the wire mother, sip a little bit of milk, and then rush back to the cloth mother. And they took this a step further, and in some experiments, they completely removed the cloth mother. So the only mother available to that particular monkey was the wire one. And these monkeys developed some pretty severe behavioral problems as a result. What they found is that this really shows the importance of comfort, of attachment, of social bonding. Without that, albeit rudimentary, sort of social interaction with a cloth mother, these monkeys didn't develop properly. And even though these are monkeys, these aren't humans, this is pretty good evidence that all great apes are social animals. We need social interaction to develop healthily. All right, so we've touched on some of the major areas of development in the lifespan here: the prenatal environment with our teratogens, infancy with our newborn reflexes, childhood with Piaget's and Vygotsky's theory. Now we're going to move on to adolescence, and then later on we'll finish up with adulthood. All right, so starting in adolescence, we're going to focus on physical changes before we move to mental changes. So, real briefly, I'm sure you all covered this at some point in high school or middle school. The physical changes that occur during adolescence. This is the onset of puberty. And during puberty, we have our pituitary glands, which you remember from our overview of the endocrine system. The pituitary gland is that master gland which sort of controls the other glands. So during puberty, the pituitary gland is going to signal to the testes or the ovaries, hey, it's that time to start producing testosterone or estrogen. And then when they get that signal, they start pumping those sex hormones into the bloodstream, and the presence of those sex hormones will start the changes that occur during puberty. Specifically, the development of secondary sex characteristics. So, sex characteristics, we've got two main categories. Primary sexual characteristics are differences between the sexes that exist from birth. So, that would be either the presence of a vagina or a penis. Secondary sex characteristics, these are things that develop during puberty. So that would be things like armpit hair, or for men, a deeper voice, or for women, the development of breasts. Those are differences between the sexes that are not present from birth. All right, so that's a very brief overview of the physical changes. I'd just like to point out in this image from your textbook here, we've got these two different people going through puberty, and we've got this dude just kind of smirking and smiling over there. Ladies, not nearly as impressed. All right, so since we're psychologists, we're a little more interested in what goes on in the mind and how that affects human behavior, a little less interested in the physical changes that occur. So, talking about the brain, the prefrontal cortex, we talked a little bit about the prefrontal cortex. Remember our buddy Phineas Gage, poor guy who got a railroad spike through his prefrontal cortex, completely destroyed it, and as a result, he pretty much turned into a jerk. The prefrontal cortex is the most advanced forward part of the brain. It's sort of your filter. It's your impulse control center. So during adolescence, your prefrontal cortex is still developing. You don't have that impulse control. However, the limbic system is fully developed. And if you remember, the limbic system is an older part of the brain. It's responsible for basic emotional responses. So you have this situation here where you have a fully developed limbic system, which is giving you these strong emotional impulses, emotional reactions to things, but you don't have the impulse control provided by the prefrontal cortex that's still developing. So you have a situation where adolescents tend to act rather immaturely. They're very emotional, they might get very aggressive, they might get just infatuated with different people or different things, but it's very brief, it's not long lasting. That is directly attributable to the fully developed limbic system, but the still developing prefrontal cortex. Adolescents will also engage in a lot of egocentric thinking. And we have to talk about a wonderful study done by Dr. Elkind. We're calling this the T-shirt study. So, in this study, the researchers recruited some high school students, and they were paid participants, and they were paid to basically wear a silly shirt for one school day. Sometimes it was like a unicorn with a rainbow background or something that would stand out quite a bit. Or at least that's what the kids thought. That's what the high schoolers thought. So at the beginning of the study, the researchers asked the participants, okay, how many of your classmates do you think will see you in this shirt and remember the next day? And of course, all these high schoolers were sort of shocked. They were mortified. Like, oh my God, are you kidding me? Like, the whole school is going to be talking about this. Everyone is going to remember this awful rainbow unicorn shirt that you're making me wear. So they wore the shirt to school, and then the next day, researchers came to school and they took some surveys of, hey, do you remember what Johnny or do you remember what Susie was wearing yesterday? Do you remember what t-shirt they had on? And as it turned out, very few people actually remembered that the participant was wearing a crazy t-shirt. So the idea here is this imaginary audience, that everyone is watching us, everyone is judging us, that we are sort of the center of attention. When in reality, that's just not the case. People are interested in themselves more than they're interested in you. So, egocentric thinking, definitely something we engage in quite a bit as adolescents. All right, so let's talk a little bit about moral development. This is something that really starts to take hold in adolescence. We kind of have a rudimentary understanding of it in childhood, but really once we go through puberty and start our journey through adolescence, that's kind of when our own personal sense of morality develops. So to start talking about moral development, I want to give you guys a scenario here. This is a scenario taken directly from Lawrence Kohlberg's research studies. Kohlberg is a big name in moral development theory. So Kohlberg would give people these little scenarios, such as a woman was near death from a unique kind of cancer. There is a drug that might save her. The drug costs $4,000 per dosage. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow the money and tried every legal means, but he could only get together about $2,000. He asked the doctor who discovered the drug for a discount or to let him pay later, but the doctor refused. So you're given the scenario and then you're asked the question, should Heinz break into the laboratory to steal the drug for his wife? Why or why not? So Kohlberg gave these little scenarios to hundreds and hundreds of different participants of different ages, and he developed some kind of broad reaching ideas for how morality develops as a result. So he developed, lo and behold, a stage theory that these developmental psychologists are so crazy about. And he put these stages, put people into three different stages. Very young people are in the pre-conventional stage. This is very self-centered thinking, and that is represented at the bottom of the pyramid here. In the pre-conventional stage, young children will obtain personal rewards and avoid personal punishment. So little kids might look at that and they'll think, no, that's something you kind of want to avoid. Or not little kids, adolescents. That's You don't want to get in trouble because then you'll go to jail. That's kind of the thinking that Kohlberg summarized in pre-conventional stage. After the pre-conventional stage, after a little bit more maturation, someone might enter the conventional stage, and this is more community-centered. Most people in the conventional moral stage of development will not grab the life-saving drug because that would be against the law. It's really important to obey the law, obey social contracts, follow family rules, group rules. So in the conventional stage, the answer would be no, don't steal the drug. And in the pre-conventional stage, the answer would be no, don't steal the drug, but for different reasons. And then finally, according to Kohlberg, the last stage of moral development is the post-conventional stage, and this is sort of ideals centered. So Heinz should absolutely steal that life-saving drug because it's totally worth it. You're saving a life, and at the very least, someone is just losing out on a little bit of money. Life is more important than $4,000. So that's Kohlberg's moral development theory, kind of in a nutshell. You've got your three stages. One is self centered, simply focused on obtaining rewards, avoiding punishment. The next is the conventional stage. This is where you kind of go along with everything just because it's not great to rock the boat. And then last is the post conventional, ideals centered. So life is very important. It's okay to break some laws in order to save a life. Some criticisms of Kohlberg's theory. Number one is a gender bias. Kohlberg did study participants that were male and participants that were female, but he sort of developed a theory that best describes male moral development. And male moral development is kind of focused on this idea of justice, kind of tit for tat, eye for an eye. If this crime occurs, then this punishment should be the result. What that type of focus on justice ignores is what's typically thought of as a more feminine moral development, which emphasizes empathy and compassion. So even though crime A was committed, punishment B is a little too harsh or something like that. So Kohlberg didn't really focus on the more typical feminine side of moral development. He focused almost exclusively on the masculine side of moral development. And the other big criticism against Kohlberg is a culture bias. So most of Kohlberg's theories make sense in an individualistic Western society where, yes, of course, you want to save this life, even though you break a law. But in a lot of Eastern cultures, the emphasis is much more on social acceptance, on not rocking the boat, on adherence to social and cultural norms. So it might be much harder for someone who comes from a more collectivistic culture to break the law in order to save a person's life. And this is just not an issue that Kohlberg addresses at all. So right there we have two big biases against Kohlberg's theories, gender bias and a culture bias. All right, so moving on, we've covered prenatal environment, infancy, childhood, adolescence, and now we're going to finish up with adulthood, which is basically everything else around age 18. So in the past, as soon as someone turned 18, up until about 25 years of age, life was pretty different a couple decades ago. Usually people in this time span, 18 to 25 years of age, they were married, and I'm talking back even as recent as like the 70s and 80s and even a little bit of the early 90s. 18 to 25-year-olds back then, they typically were married, they had children, they were moved out of their parents' house, they were independent financially, socially from their parents. They were beginning careers, they owned a home. Things were very, very different than 18 to 25-year-olds have it these days. Marriage is typically put off till later and later. Children are typically put off until later and later. There absolutely are people in this age span here who do have children, but it's not necessarily the norm anymore. So all these characteristics of 18 to 25-year-olds are very different today. Nowadays, 18 to 25-year-olds are maybe married, maybe not, probably don't have kids. They might have moved out of their parents' house, maybe not. Careers, probably not so much. They might still be in college, like you guys, or pursuing education elsewhere. Home ownership, well, that is definitely something that has changed. The vast majority of 18 to 25-year-olds do not own a home currently in 2022, 2023. So things are very different than they used to be. And this has created a new stage in development that researchers are calling emerging adulthood. And it's called emerging adulthood because it's definitely beyond the stage of adolescence, but it's not quite what we used to think of as adulthood. Again, adulthood usually being marked by some of those key milestones listed here: marriage, children, independence, beginning of career, home ownership. So after emerging adulthood, this new stage in development, we have early adulthood. And this is where early adulthood is marked by some of those classic milestones: financial independence from parents, social independence from parents, marriage, children, home ownership. And this is typically defined by a fully developed prefrontal cortex, which means impulsivity just drops. We have that impulse control center in the brain fully online, fully working. After early adulthood, we have middle adulthood. This is where we typically have reduced fertility. This is when women typically go through menopause. This is when we think of people having those midlife crises. Now, I want to focus on the midlife crisis for just a little bit. Now, this term midlife crisis is very common. It's very well known. I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. This is the middle-aged dude going out and buying a super fast red convertible because, you know, he's getting older and he's having a crisis about it. He's having a midlife crisis. Well, there was a study done and they looked at some of the common stressors that occur in someone's midlife. And those would be things like the death of your parents. This usually occurs around age 50, 60, midlife. And divorce usually occurs. This is when people start to have pretty serious chronic health problems. So these are all very common stressors that people have around this time in life. But only about 10% of people this age would admit to be going through anything resembling a crisis. So the fact that there are some stressors that we experience in this stage in life, but it's not necessarily a full-on crisis. So that idea of a midlife crisis is a little bit of a myth. After middle adulthood, we have late adulthood. So in late adulthood, we typically think of people as being mentally a little bit slower, but we have something that sort of compensates for that, and that's accumulated knowledge. And we'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the intelligence chapter. So accumulated knowledge will compensate for the decreased learning ability. And what we do have is actually an improvement on a couple skills in late adulthood. Usually we think of late adulthood where everything is actually worse, cognitively speaking. That's not the case. Research shows a little bit differently. People in later adulthood are actually much better, much more practiced at social interactions than younger people. And by all accounts, they're actually quite good at them. They're better. Prospective memory tasks. Here's another new term that you may not have heard. So a prospective memory task is a memory task to remember to do something in the future. So if you are driving home and your oil change light comes on, uh, the fact that you remember to schedule an oil change is a prospective memory task. To remember to do something in the future, to remember to change your oil in the future. Turns out older adults, very, very good at these tasks. They know their brains very well. They know how their minds work. They know if they need to remember something that they need to write themselves a reminder. And the research is showing over and over and over again, the key to happiness in late adulthood is to stay busy, have a purpose, have a task, have something that gets you out of bed in the morning and keeps you occupied. The more you sort of sit stagnant, typically the less happy you will be. Some examples of people who are very active and happy into later adulthood. First example here is Ed Whitlock. That's this friendly looking fella on the bottom right hand side of the slide. Ed Whitlock is a famous name in the running community. He's famous for running a sub 3 hour marathon at the age of 74. For those of you who are unfamiliar with running, a sub 3 hour marathon is a pretty good goal. That is definitely a very something to be proud of for sure. That equals something roughly like 7 minute miles. So a marathon is 26.2 miles. So to run a 3 hour marathon, you would have to run all 26.2 miles at an average pace of about 7 minutes per mile. I don't know about you guys, but that sounds really hard to do. I can barely run 7 minute miles for like 3 miles straight. I can't imagine doing it for 26 miles straight. And I certainly can't imagine doing it at age 74. Ed Whitlock wasn't done though. At age 85, he ran a sub 4 hour marathon. And I don't know the average minute mile pace off the top of my head for a 4 hour marathon, but that's still pretty darn impressive to run a marathon at age 85. So he's obviously got himself a task. He's got something that he's working towards, and he seems to be enjoying the process of it. And then my last example here, Pete Seeger. Some of you may be familiar with that name. Pete Seeger is a very famous, or was a very famous musician. He recently passed away just a couple years ago. He was famous for kind of bringing back folk music. He was sort of a labor organizer for a long time. He sang songs and made music with people like Woody Guthrie and Bob Dylan for a little bit there. So if you click on this link, which is provided on the Canvas page, you can see Pete Seeger at age 94 playing at Farm Aid, which is this big concert in upstate New York. Thousands and thousands of people attended. They attract some very big names. On stage with Pete Seeger, there are Dave Matthews Band and Neil Young, and he's basically leading a sing along. If I could be doing something like that when I'm 95, 94 years old, well, I'd say that things went pretty well. All right, and that's all I have for the developmental chapter. This is definitely just a very, very shallow dip into a lot of different topics in the developmental psych subfield. The ones that I talked about, though, fair bet to say that you might see them on an exam.